BTN Best Business and Finance Presenter of 2011.
Before we do that, how are business schools, these are the places that hand out the increasingly common MBA degree, going to stay relevant? Cynics would argue that some of the best minds in the world have been educated at places like Harvard and Stanford, places that charge hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and many of those people involved in that education process are at the helm of corporations and at government in the United States and other parts of the world, and have led to the collapse of the financial system as we know it, etc., etc. Professor John Board is the Dean of the Henley Business School. He's in South Africa to look at the operations, I guess. John, good evening.
Hello. There's that small pause where I try and decide, is it easier to answer the question or just panic about being sandwiched between a piece on models and Mr. Joff in his business photographs?
Do you like the book, incidentally?
It's very fine. Some of the best photographs I've seen for a long time. I guess given the crisis at the moment, the fact you had it open a picture of vultures and decaying flesh is probably helpful as well. I guess the answer on business schools is, I think, but I would say this, wouldn't I? They're jolly good things.
Of course.
MBAs are jolly good. Everybody I can hear applauding already at the very thought of it. So what went wrong? Answer, a lot of business schools and a lot of MBAs, and more particularly a lot of MBA students, lost sight of the fact that, as Mr. Joffe will tell you, what you really need to be successful in business is to understand business, to have great ideas and implement them properly. What good business schools, sorry for the plug, such as ourselves who've been doing it for 70 years, teach is how to think about problems. What a lot of people got into was really two things. One is thinking about, if I've read this book, then I know how to make lots of money.
It doesn't help that there is the Idiot's Guide, the 30-second MBA, the MBA that you can do via Twitter, via correspondence and all of that sort of stuff, because the MBA has kind of been abused quite a lot, I suspect, in the image of the MBA, therefore, has been sullied.
Oh, I think these books are fantastic ideas, because it means I know exactly what everyone else is thinking, and that's how you really make money in business. Right? Where people make mistakes is just thinking, because I've read the Idiot's Guide, I'm the one that makes money. Right? Yeah. The old story, which I always use, is, how do you make money in business? Answer, find an idiot and trade with them.
Okay. Excellent. I'll ask Brian Joffe that question.
So, please do, but he was no one's form of idiot. He's the one who, innovated and thought about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, MBAs are great things, but you should remember they teach general management, how to run things, how to think about running things. They don't just give you the magic formula.
And a lot of people go into the MBA process or to the executive education process thinking that they're about to go and learn the silver bullet. But a lot of the time, people go in with that mindset are going to be doomed to failure because it's not going to provide them with the education that they'd hoped for.
Well, I think it does provide the education they hope for if they take it in the right way and the business school teaches it responsibly, which, let's face it, all of the, world rank, the Harvards and so forth really do. It teaches people things that may seem like common sense, but it just says, here are good, simple things that you should understand about the way you deal with people, the way you deal with the real world, the way you deal with crises and so forth. It's not the sort of thing where I can tell you the moment inflation in South Africa goes up or interest rates hit 6%, this is what you have to do. What I can do is...
We wish we had... Our inflation's at 6%. Our interest rates are at 9%. And that's good for us.
Well, the one advantage you have is I sit in the UK with interest rates at 0.5%, and I'm thinking, what on earth do I do with my savings?
Yeah.
Which is, let that be the worst of our problems.
Yeah, exactly. Why then, if MBAs are so good, and why, if the executive education industry is as good as it is the world in such a mess?
I don't want to sound over flippant and make 3 jerky comments. Just think how much worse it would be without us.
I asked for that. I'm sorry. Yes, but yeah. I mean, here we got the brightest minds in the world running corporations, running many of the governments of the world, and we are in something of a pickle.
Well, going back to, the old cliches and the things that, if you like, business schools or some business schools don't think about. It is, running businesses, it's not a science in the same way, my kids learn about physics and so forth. If you learn physics, you drop an apple and it lands on the ground pretty much most of the time.
Yes.
Except in Star Trek, which I grew up with. If you run a business, it's a social science, right? Things happen roughly the way you think it might work, and often they don't. And the trouble with crises is that's when things aren't working the way they should. So it's almost impossible, however clever you are, to say, right, this has gone wrong, this is how we fix it. And we should face the fact that we don't know the answer. We think we know the answer, we can argue our way through it, but it doesn't tell us exactly what the answer is. If you look at the crisis now, you look around the world, people just don't know what is the right way out. Look at the euro, started with great intentions. even now, you can see the Germans themselves are disagreeing with each other, which is unusual for Germans, I should say.
But is the Eurozone doomed to your mind?
I think the real difficulty with the euro is, and the problem with a lot of the discussion about it, is people don't realise that the euro it's a political thing. It was started for political reasons. It was introduced for political reasons. The reason, for example, Greece, Italy, Spain, and so forth entered was because it was politically expedient for them to do so.
And economically expedient in the short term.
Well, it was economically expedient for them.
Yes.
In both the short and, I suspect, the long term, I have to tell you. But it was, expedient for Germany, France, and the big euro countries to allow and encourage them in. And so the real problem you see now is, to keep the show on the road, you need this big bailout.
Yes.
You get the Germans saying, well, we're not going to fund it anymore at the Bundesbank and at the government finance level. You get the politicians saying, well, for goodness sake, keep going. It's a bit like playing double or quits.
Yes, and that's what it does feel like.
Well, and I think to an extent that's what it is. And of course, what you've got are governments essentially betting against increasingly powerful international investment banks. And the problem is, if the Germans say we're not going to bail them out, then the answer is the investment banks have an incentive to bet against the Italians. I was going to say lira, but that's that's the week after next.
Yes, it is.
So to stop the runs, you've got to bail out. The more you bail out, the less incentive there is for the Italians and the Greeks to get their house in order.
So how does this particular game play out then?
My prediction is in 5 years' time, there'll be something called the euro.
Yes, I suspect so, because political will is very, very strong to maintain the euro. The trouble is, the euro will only be usable in only a fraction of the countries necessarily that it's available now.
I suspect not more than one country will actually leave the euro.
And that'll be Greece?
Well, Greece is the obvious one, because it's relatively small. And it'll be welcomed back in again as soon as it possibly can be.
Right.
Because the political game here is euro equals Europe. I did like your introduction about the OECD in Paris, with the word cooperation in the middle. It's the last thing you see at the moment.
There is very little cooperation. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the detail of whatever settlement is reached at the moment has to be hard fought, because if it is too easy to settle, there's too much compromise, and we're going to be stuck with the same problem in 5 years' time as we're stuck with now, surely.
Again, I'm tempted to be flippant and say we'll be stuck with the problem in 5 years' time, whatever we decide at the
Possibly,
moment.
Yeah.
But absolutely, it is what you see in Europe and what we see elsewhere, and you see it in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, is a move and the tension of saying we need trading blocks and lots more trade cooperation, and at the same time that only works really well if you've got much more political union than anyone has taste for. So there's a tension built into that mix of politics and economics that we see, and that'll happen everywhere.
History students, in 500 years' time, they'll look back at history. What will have lasted longer, the euro or the MBA?
Oh, the MBA, for absolute sure.
Professor John Board, he's the Dean of the Henley Business School.